Welcome back to another Teaching Sound Doctrine Bible class. We finished up our study of the church and what it means to be part of it and how to recognize it and how it was established. And tonight we're going to give you an introduction to the book of Galatians. Now, we're not going to get into a lot of scripture. We're going to give you a lot of scriptures that you can write down. So have a pen and paper handy so that you can jot these down. Either that or go to our website and download the lesson there. I also want you to keep in mind as we're doing this study that you need to remember to always ask yourself the questions who, what, when, where, why, and how. Those are key to any Bible study. So always keep that in mind. So as you follow along with us, kind of be thinking in your head and asking yourself, well, who are they speaking to? What are they speaking about? Is it relevant to the apostles, or is it directed only at the apostles, or whatever? And that way you can get a good solid foundation underneath you. Now today we're going to give you, like I said, an introduction to the book of Galatians, when it was written, who the writer was, some of the other aspects of it, and then next week we will get into the actual study. Jerry, is there anything you'd like to say before we get into the class?
Well, just that Galatians is a very interesting study. It is one of Paul's shortest epistles, and it has a great deal of meat for everyone. So with that said, I would urge everyone to take notes and to look carefully at everything that is said in this study, and to understand that there is a lot of material in here that is comparable to what Paul wrote in the book of Romans. And sometimes in dealing with the book of Galatians, you go back to Romans and look at some similar material. In fact, some people teach Romans and Galatians together because they are similar books.
Amen, Jerry. I couldn't agree with that more. Well, folks, tonight, like I said, we're going to do the introduction. And the first thing I think we have to establish is who the writer was. Well, the Apostle Paul, according to chapter 1, verse 1, chapter 5, verse 2. This was the unanimous view of the early church, and even those modern critics who challenged the authorship of many of the New Testament books concede that Galatians is truly a Pauline book. So we've established now that Paul's the writer. So what was the date of the writing? You see, the dating of Galatians is affected by one's view of whether the churches of Galatia were located in the north central part of Asia Minor, what we would call ethnic Galatia, or in the south central part, the Roman province of Galatia. The northern Galatia theory maintains that the churches were in the north and that Paul had been there until the beginning of his third missionary journey. That would be around 54, 55 AD, according to Acts chapter 18 and verse 23. So this would require that Paul wrote his epistle sometime toward the end of that journey, or afterwards, around 57 or 58 AD or later. So we also believe that the meeting described in Galatians 2, 1 through 10 took place during the Jerusalem conference, related in Acts chapter 15, verses 1 through 29. This view opens several possibilities for the place and the time of the writing. It would be in Corinth in the period, say, of Acts 18, 1 through 17. Antioch in the period of Acts 18, 22. Ephesus in the period of Acts 19, 1 through 41. Macedonia or Achaia in the period of Acts 20, verses 1 through 3. Now, with such uncertainty, no one can be dogmatic about this. But in the view of Paul's lengthy stay in Ephesus, that would seem a likely possibility. And the date would be approximately AD 55. Now, it also behooves us to understand this province of Galatia. You see, the region of Galatia was where Paul preached on his first evangelistic tour. On that trip, he preached and met opposition from Jews in the cities of Derbe, Lystra, Iconium, according to Acts 13 and 14. Galatia was populated by a Celtic people known as the Gauls, who had invaded Greece from the north in about 300 BC, after a time of independence in which the Roman Empire or the Roman government recognized their kings. They became a part of the Roman Empire during the reign of Augustus Caesar. So in Paul's day, the Roman province of Galatia included the old kingdom of Galatia proper. To the north, and also part of Laconia, Pisidia, I'm not sure how to pronounce it. It's Phrygia. Jerry, you can help me out on that.
Phrygia.
What'd you say?
Phrygia.
Phrygia. Okay, there we go. Well, all of these adjoined to the south. So since the letter clearly implies that the churches were all found in the same general period, Paul could not have been writing to both areas. It is now generally agreed, though, that he was writing to the southern Galatian churches of Lystra, Derbe, Iconium, Pisidia, and Antioch, and others in that vicinity, according to Martin on page 452. Now, on his second trip, 49 to 52 AD, Paul and Silas visited them again in Acts chapter 16, verses 1 through 5. It wasn't long, however, before some of the Jewish Christians came in and began teaching that Gentile Christians needed to be circumcised and keep the law of Moses, similar to what happened in Antioch and Syria in Acts chapter 15 and verse 1. So in an effort to persuade the Galatians, it appears the tactic was to discredit Paul as an apostle, challenge his concept of the gospel of Christ, and change his doctrine with leading to loose living. So, Jerry, why don't you pick up from there and tell us about the people of Galatia?
All right, the Galatians, they were a strange people. In fact, they're described as Coney Barrenhausen, who wrote the Life and Epistles of the Apostle Paul, described them as susceptible of quick impressions and sudden changes, with a fickleness equal to their courage and enthusiasm, and a constant liability to that disunion which is the fruit of excessive vanity. Now, these characteristics actually are seen in Paul's words to them. They had readily received the gospel and would have plucked out their eyes for him, but then so soon removed from that gospel at the behest of those false teachers. They had begun to run well, Paul said, but then they were hindered and bewitched, and were as anxious to bite and devour one another as they were to exchange the gospel for another, which Paul said is not another. The readiness of those Galatian people to exchange allegiances was seen early in their history when they came southward. Coney Barrenhausen say, quote, they hired themselves out as mercenary soldiers. They were the royal guards of the kings of Syria and the Mamelukes and of the Ptolemies of Egypt, unquote. This propensity was apparently manifested also in their fickleness regarding the gospel and their readiness to listen to false teachers who called Paul's apostolic authority into question. I knew a man who was quick to change his mind without considering solid evidence. In fact, one of my sons once told me about this man. He said his belief is whatever he reads last. Well, that seems to be the case with the people of Galatia, or the Gauls. Now think about that. The Galatia of the East was really the Gaul of the East. The epistle to the Galatians would be more literally and more correctly be called the epistle to the Gauls. When Livy, in his account of the Roman campaigns in Galatia, speaks of those inhabitants, he always calls them Gauls. When the Greek historians speak of the inhabitants of ancient France, the word they use is Galatians. So the two terms are merely Greek and Latin forms of the same barbarian appellation. That's what Conybeare and Howson say. So understand this, that the Galatians were the Gauls and the Gauls were the French. So if you know how fickle French have been through the years, then you can understand how fickle the Galatians were. These fickle barbarians had a propensity for vacillation and sudden changes of their minds. That, of course, was graphically illustrated in their reception of Paul and Barnabas as gods after they had healed a crippled man at Lystra. That's found in Acts chapter 14, verses 8 through 18. But when Jews from Antioch and Iconium who opposed Paul's preaching came to Lystra, these Galatians who had earlier hailed Paul as a deity were persuaded to stone him and leave him for dead in Acts 14:19. So it was that kind of vacillating nature which could easily be turned from the gospel as Paul addressed in this Galatian epistle. It's our conviction that this epistle was written to those churches which were established on the first preaching tour of Paul and Barnabas through the cities of Italia, Perga, Antioch of Pisidia, Iconium, Derbe, and Lystra in the southern region of Galatia, as recorded by the inspired Luke in Acts chapters 13 and 14. Jim?
Yes, Jerry. Look around you today and you can see folks who are just as fickle as the Galatians were. I mean, I love that little saying that his belief was whatever he read last. And there's a lot of people like that. They turn on a dime. And, we can't be that way. But to continue on, the churches in Galatia were being influenced by those who would pervert the gospel of Christ. Look at chapter 1, verses 6 and 7, and then look again in chapter 3 and verse 1. These were known as Judaizing teachers. These individuals taught that the Gentile Christians needed to be circumcised and to keep the law of Moses. Acts 15:1. Paul recognized that this doctrine would jeopardize the salvation of those souls who accepted it. Just simply look at chapter 5 and verse 4. Because the enemies of the true gospel were trying to support their case by undermining Paul's authority, as the true gospel were trying to support their case by undermining Paul's authority as an apostle of Christ. So it was necessary for him to verify that he was truly an apostle, not from men nor through man, but through Jesus Christ and God the Father in verse 1:1, or chapter 1, verse 1. During his first preaching tour, which took place around 46-48 AD, Paul, together with Barnabas, had the opportunity to establish several churches in the Roman province of Galatia. We learn that from Acts chapter 13, verse 14, chapter 14, verse 23. On his second trip between 49 and 52 AD, Paul and Silas visited them again, according to Acts chapter 16, verses 1 through 5. It wasn't long, however, before some of the Jewish Christians came in and began teaching the Gentile Christians needed to be circumcised and to keep the law of Moses. So similar to what happened in Antioch of Syria in Acts 15:1, in an effort to persuade the Galatians, it appears the tactic was to discredit Paul as an apostle, challenge his concepts of the gospel of Christ, and change his doctrine with leading to loose living. So that leads us now into our first chapter of Galatians. And we're going to look at Galatians chapter 1 through 5, which will be in our next lesson. But I think what you need to do with anything you read, try to figure out who wrote the book, what were they writing about, who were they writing to. Everything will fall in place if you learn these things. And knowing the year and the times, or about the times that these took place, will give you a better understanding of the scriptures overall. Jerry, would you like to say something before we go ahead and close out the class?
Well, one thing we didn't cover, Jim, was the purpose of the book in this introduction. The purpose is very similar to the purpose of the book of Hebrews. The only difference is that this is written to Gentiles and Hebrews is written to Jews. In the book of Hebrews, the writer, who I believe was the Apostle Paul, was seeking to keep them from returning to the law of Moses in the face of the persecution that had come upon them and that would come upon them. There was a danger that they would abandon Christ and go back to the law of Moses. And so he makes several arguments to keep them from doing that. The same is true in the book of Galatians, except Paul here is addressing it to Gentiles, so they wouldn't go back to the law of Moses. They were never under it in the first place, but they were being led to believe that they had to embrace at least part of the law of Moses in order to be saved. And so Paul he deals a great deal with not only the law of Moses, but he deals with the promise that was made to Abraham. And later on in the book, we will see that the law of Moses did not negate that promise to Abraham that God would bless all families of the earth through the seed of Abraham, who was Jesus Christ.
We're absolutely correct, Jerry. Now, folks, we're going to go ahead and leave the program at this time to you. It has been recorded, and I will have it up on our website before too long. I always post a link on our Facebook page, Teaching Sound Doctrine. So you can always go there and get a link to the website where our audios and videos are. And Jerry and I enjoy teaching these classes, and we hope that you're learning a lot. And until next week, we will bid you Godspeed, and may God bless.